Those who read about the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor know that President Franklin Roosevelt had provoked the Japanese attack to justify America's entry into World War II. Most Americans were against joining the war, but the attack on Pearl Harbor provided the excuse needed to declare war. The best book on this topic is Day of Deceit by former World War II Navy officer Robert Stinnett. The topics he covers are controversial because most people refuse to accept that Roosevelt and top military leaders in Washington, D.C. failed to inform the commanders in Hawaii that a Japanese fleet was coming to attack. Stinnett documents that the Japanese fleet hit a typhoon en route, and ships became separated. The Japanese had planned to maintain radio silence, but were forced to send coded messages in order to regroup. There is debate about how much of the Japanese naval code the Americans could read, but American ships and U.S. military signals intelligence intercept stations in the Philippines, Hawaii, Alaska, and the American West Coast could detect Japanese military radio traffic and determine its origin using triangulation. This was their purpose, and it doesn't matter if they couldn't read the coded messages. Learning that Japanese warships were north of Hawaii was alarming. The commanders in Hawaii would have placed forces on alert, sent ships to sea, and dispatched air patrols to investigate. Once detected, the Japanese fleet was unlikely to continue since the key element of surprise was lost. This did not occur because the White House failed to inform commanders in Hawaii. The United States had broken the Japanese diplomatic code, called Purple, in September 1940. On November 19th, American codebreakers intercepted a message from Tokyo to diplomatic posts that instructed these offices to destroy all codes, coding machines, and secret papers if they heard the words "East Wind Rain" in the daily weather forecast. On December 4th, the codebreakers intercepted this so-called winds message, but Army Chief of Staff George Marshall waited until the morning of December 7th to send urgent messages to commanders in Hawaii that an attack was imminent. An example of war preparations in 1941 was the creation of the American Volunteer Group, which became known as the Flying Tigers. Covert funding allowed 300 American military pilots to be hired as mercenaries, and new American aircraft were shipped to China. If these attacked a Japanese aircraft, it would be a blatant act of war. Painting Chinese insignia on American aircraft flown by American pilots, all paid for by the United States, would fool no one. By late 1941, pilots and aircraft had arrived in Asia and were divided into two squadrons, at Kunming in China, and a third at Mingaladon Airport near Rangoon. The pilots practiced maneuvers but did not attack Japanese aircraft or airfields until 12 days after Pearl Harbor. The creation and deployment of the Flying Tigers provoked the Japanese and only makes sense if the White House knew that war would occur in late 1941. Evidence of forewarning also exists based on events in the Far East. The 4th Marine Regiment protected American diplomatic territory in Shanghai, China, for 15 years. The Japanese had invaded China and seized Shanghai, but allowed Western nations to maintain their business operations protected by Western troops. But chaos from the war in China and the presence of Japanese troops worried American commanders. If war occurred, the 800 Marines and 5 Navy gunboats would be quickly captured. American commanders began demanding a withdrawal from China starting in August 1941. This plea was ignored for months, until a November 14, 1941 press conference, when President Roosevelt announced, quote, "The government of the United States has decided to withdraw the American Marine detachments now maintained ashore in China, at Peiping, Xinjiang, and Shanghai. It is reported that the withdrawal will begin shortly." U.S. Navy gunboats and Marines departed China on November 27th and arrived in the Philippines on December 1st, just 6 days before the attack at Pearl Harbor. Admiral Thomas Hart, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Asiatic Fleet, ordered the Marines to prepare for war. On December 3rd, he told the commander of the 4th Marines, quote, "We will be at war with the Japanese within a week." The Marines had been withdrawn from China, and Admiral Hart somehow knew the Japanese would attack around December 7th. Vice Admiral William Halsey in Hawaii also knew the Japanese were about to attack. Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Stark in Washington ordered the 2 aircraft carriers in Hawaii, with the large escort fleet of 21 modern ships, to deliver planes to Wake and Midway Islands. 10 days before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, this task force sailed from Pearl Harbor bound for Wake Island. Once they were at sea, Admiral Halsey signed off on Battle Order No. 1, which put the USS Enterprise and her supporting cruisers and destroyers on war footing. The crew began adding armor on fighter planes and painting them with combat colors. Continuous air patrols circled above the task force, with orders to assume any Japanese aircraft or ships encountered were hostile. The warships remaining in Pearl Harbor on December 7th were mostly old relics of World War I. Stinnett suggests the battleships sunk at Pearl Harbor were decoys after Washington sent the new aircraft carriers and newest destroyers and cruisers on a contrived mission away from Pearl Harbor. Note that the U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet was based at San Diego until President Roosevelt ordered it deployed to Pearl Harbor in 1940, despite objections from admirals. The commander of this fleet, Admiral James Richardson, believed his fleet at Pearl Harbor would be the first target in the event of war with Japan and was vulnerable to air attack. He traveled to Washington, D.C. twice to argue that his fleet must return to San Diego. Admiral Richardson was fired by President Roosevelt in February 1941 and retired from the Navy. There are more examples that indicate President Roosevelt's staff knew a huge Japanese fleet was heading to Hawaii. This was expected after they organized an oil embargo to paralyze the Japanese economy. See the short video linked below about America's mobilization for war starting in 1938 and the American invasion of Iceland 5 months prior to Pearl Harbor. A couple odd events in 1941 can be labeled as coincidences, but when several more are encountered, the truth about Pearl Harbor becomes obvious.